So in this video, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about foster care, non-residence, and kinship care. These are three areas that you'll be involved in some systems more, in some systems maybe less, based on how your system is structured. But again, I have Laura Thompson, who has a lot of experience behind these issues. And so the first topic that we'd like to maybe touch on is foster care. So first of all, can you talk a little bit about foster care connected to the Every Student Success Act and its impact on how we deal with foster care students?
Yes, so depending on when you're viewing this clip, foster care used to be very much connected to homelessness. We've kind of weeded those apart. Students awaiting foster care used to be included under McKinney-Vento. And a few years back, the Every Student Succeeds Act was updated to reaffirm McKinney-Vento, but sort of separated out some of the services for foster care. So Every Student Succeeds Act reinforces the Fostering Connections Act, which is basically that we are providing very similar services to homeless individuals for our foster care children, making sure that we're holding best interest meetings if they're moving around to different homes, making sure that they're getting meals covered at school, making sure that we're working on lining up transportation for those kids. So the Every Student Succeeds Act requires both state agencies and local education agencies to work with child welfare agencies. So that is like our department in Carroll County, the Department of Social Services, to ensure educational stability for children in foster care, if I could sum that up. Our goal is to limit educational disruption, again, by looking at whether best interest determination, is it best for a child to stay in the school they've been attending, or if they've been moved further away in the county or even out of the county, but we still consider them our student. What is our decision on their schooling? Are we transferring schools, or are we trying to keep them in a Carroll County public school and bus them in? So the goal really is, again, to support children in foster care and look at their best interest placement.
And again, those are the same kinds of questions you're asking when you're talking with homeless scenarios. But I think they have weeded it out. While their needs might be similar, they are a different population.
Yes.
And then it might impact the funding of where the funds come from.
Exactly.
That, Title I and homelessness and...
Right. So McKinney-Vento basically asks that we allocate Title I funds to our homeless population. There's also the ability to apply for a sub-grant. We have not done that in Carroll County for a few years because we've been able to use the title money set aside already. We're able to cover our homeless needs that way. So we basically are able to use Title I money to provide extra supports to our students who are identified as homeless. And that can include tutoring services, counseling services, sometimes the purchase of educational materials. We have students that are attending our Career and Tech Center or are already starting some community college courses and need assistance with purchasing books and materials. Sometimes it's outfits for their programs at the Tech Center. We can use the Title I set-aside money for that. Transportation is also covered through the school system, so for homeless students. Where the difference is under foster care is the Every Student Succeeds Act charges the foster care agencies, social service agencies, with paying for the transportation. So what we get into is a collaboration with the agency, thank you, where we've developed a memorandum of understanding, and we have a form that we use. Is very simple, that first the Department of Social Services will fill out if they are placing a child in a home. They will send to our liaison, our foster care liaison and student services, a description of who the child is, the home that they're thinking about placing the child in, and the school that they're looking at requesting. And it's basically asking, can you please identify what would be the cost of transporting the child to this school? So we then send that down to our transportation department. we figure out a bus route, what the estimated cost is, we give that back to the Department of Social Services, so they can say yay or nay. Like, yes, we can fund this, we'd like to put this into place, can you please line up busing to place this child in this home and, you know, go to and from that school. There may be times that it's not feasible. You know, maybe our local agency has had to place a child out of county and the transportation would be really unreasonable. And so once they get that estimate and they say, weighing the pros and cons, we think we're gonna move the child and have them enroll in that other county. So that is some of the difference between foster care and homelessness. Much of the funding comes out of the school system. Foster care, much of the funding comes out of the social service agency.
And I think when you're working with these agencies, you know, we get hung up on releases and sharing of information, but at least for our system, we have those letters of understanding that says, you know, we know we're working in the best interest of students, so we're able to share information back and forth because we're working together to plan educationally for them.
Right.
And so one thing that comes up sometimes is about the custody of foster care students, you know, who has rights. I think you would get a court order about how that all works, but the agency often either has final say or they have joint custody along with the foster parents. Has that been your experience over the time?
Yes, within Carroll County, they will generally state who the social worker is that's assigned to the student, and as a school system, we usually list that agent as a guardian for the child, in addition to the foster care parents being granted, if you will, like a temporary guardianship over that child. So when they're at the, you know, working with the school, that they can be involved in the enrollment, be involved in communicating with teachers, you know, that it's not always the worker that's per se doing that, but the worker can. That the social service worker can come visit the child or can ask questions of the school, because technically the agency may be the guardian of the child.
Right.
So each year when we're identifying, you know, foster care children, we are looking at who are the foster care parents and who is the agency that's overseeing them. And when we have kids coming from other state agencies, it's not uncommon for us to get children placed in Carroll County from Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Frederick County. And so those agencies will apply, and we'll get to that a little bit later under non-resident, but they will basically say, we'd like to place a child in your county. They'll do appropriate paperwork and give us a letter from the agency explaining who the guardians of the child are.
Right. The only other thing I would say with working with DSS and the orders that you get, sometimes when you have, sometimes they'll be placed in foster care, but then they'll also be placed with a family member. And so those can become pretty complicated cases about what's happening. But I think the final thing I would say about foster care is the hope is that especially if the parents are still around and they're connected, that they want reunification.
Yes.
And so they're working through that. They want this to be a temporary situation so that they can work with the family, so that everybody can come together as a family again.
Yes, reunification is often the primary goal whenever they can rehabilitate a situation so that parents are able to resume their role in the child's life safely and appropriately. So yes, parents aren't stripped of their rights as parents. If they can be involved, of course we'd like that, and yes, that is the goal of social services.
And so to the degree possible, according to the agency, they'll want those natural parents, biological parents, to be involved in those cases. So those are some things to consider when you're working through foster care situations. And so the next one, let's kind of move on, and we'll talk about this issue of non-residents. Okay?
Yes.
So in order for a student to attend any school system, they have to be bona fide residents of that district or that county. And if not, then we would deem you possibly as a non-resident And so let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what happens.
Yes.
And so the first one with regard to them, what determines whether a family qualifies or not under the provisions of non-resident, and what's the intent of the provision?
Yes. So I'll tell you what, I think you'd probably agree, this is one that we are always asking each other about. It can get tricky and complicated, but essentially, yes, since you typically have students in your school system who live in your district, what gets trickier is when students are not living in Carroll County, and there may be situations that warrant a child coming to our school system. So we have an application process. There are some cases where we have to charge tuition, and some cases where we can waive tuition. So the non-resident application includes a variety of different categories. It could be as simple as a family is moving into Carroll County. They have a contract or a lease on a home that shows generally within 45 days they're planning to move into Carroll County. And in which case, we're going to probably waive tuition. We're saying, yep, we acknowledge you've provided the documentation in the application that you're moving in. We're gonna give you a certain amount of time to attend before we need proof that you actually moved in and settled on your home. We also have cases where students might be moving out of the county. Perhaps they've purchased a home or renting a home and they would like to finish out a given period of time in the school system. Maybe it's a clean break at a semester, maybe it's to the end of the school year, and they're asking, rather than moving to start my child, can I apply to continue them in Carroll County till we leave? So that's a pretty clean moving in and out of Carroll County. Another one that we can look at is, suppose someone, because of a hardship reason, is seeking guardianship of a student. So they're able, maybe it's a relative, maybe it's some other kind of caretaker that is actually going through the court system and can show a court document that they are in the process of applying through the court. It can take a while with the court. So we're able to say, yes, for this period of time, we can approve the child coming to Carroll County. We will waive tuition, but we're going to follow up at a given time frame and see where you are with that court case.
And so in those situations, maybe what you have is that the parents are living in Pennsylvania and the kids have come to our county to stay with grandma. And so the grandmother, the parent may have been drug involved and just could not take care of the children. And so and then they would maybe seek guardianship of them through Carroll County courts, and then we may grant the non-residents in that particular situation.
Right, and so there are a number of hardship situations, and we're going to get to kinship care in a few minutes, but the difference with non-resident is the children are coming from, like their parents are outside of Carroll County somewhere and are perhaps living with someone other than a relative if it's Maryland, or if they're coming from out of state, we have to look. If it's out of state, it's definitely non-resident. But the hardship categories we might be looking at are, yes, is a parent unfortunately in drug treatment or drug involved, maybe is absent from the whole situation, they can't locate the parent. Is the parent incarcerated? Is the parent, did the parent pass away? Variety of different hardship situations. Military, active military. It could be that the parent had to leave for duty and has to leave a child with a relative. So there are different hardship situations that, again, we can waive tuition. We can say, yes, that child can come into our county and tuition free and attend Carroll County Public Schools during that time frame. Tuition based. If you don't mind, I'll move to tuition based. There are other provisions where we can say, you don't need a hardship situation. If you'd like to pay tuition, you may come to Carroll County. We offer that benefit to our employees at a reduced rate. So there's a nominal fee for in-state residents, and then it's more for out-of-state, but it's half of what we charge normal tuition. If a parent or guardian is employed in Carroll County, they may pay tuition to bring their student here, that's an option. Or if their child's attending daycare in Carroll County, but again, we would charge tuition. And tuition is sometimes more than people realize. In-state, it is approaching $7,000 or so. Out-of-state tuition is about $14,000. So we're talking like a serious, almost like private school tuition. So we do need to explain that to parents up front when they're considering these situations.
And then you always get this situation where the parents are lying about where they're living or what the situation is. Just today, I was, we've always had some suspicion of a family that I'm working with that they reside in another state, in Pennsylvania. So I went to their house very early this morning, looked for the car that I know the parent drove. So and then I'm building my case to be able to have a sit-down meeting and say, it's based on my investigation, and maybe we can talk about that investigation, that we would exclude your child at a certain date, or allow them maybe to finish the school year, but with the expectation that they would enroll in whatever state they're in, or whatever county they're in, that they would not be able to return to Carroll County Public Schools. So can you talk a little bit about
the investigations?
those
Yes.
investigations?
Sometimes we end up being private detectives.
Yes.
It can be uncomfortable at times, but yeah, there are a number of steps that sometimes, it's interesting how things will come to light. Sometimes a student will be late to school every day and the teacher says, hey, what's going on? And the child says, I have to get up at 5 o'clock and we drive an hour to get to school. And we start saying, well, where are you coming from? And students will inadvertently let us know that they are not in Carroll County. We've certainly had situations where friendly neighbors will call and report, hey, this family moved out months ago, but we see them dropping their children off at the bus stop, and we just wanted to alert someone. So a variety of reasons can trigger us suspecting that a child is not in the county. And yes, there are a number of things we can do. We can certainly make home visits. There have been times where I've actually gone to homes and somebody else answers the door and they say, no, but gosh, can you tell there's other people that keep coming by to collect bills that they don't live here anymore? And you're like, oh, sorry, okay. But home visits, it could be, you can't even track down a family and you're calling emergency contacts to ask neighbors, do you know where this family might be? Sometimes we get suspicious leases that are provided and we're looking in a property search and we see that someone else owns the home and we can communicate to that person and find out, are you really renting out your home or did someone falsify a document? Sometimes we know that someone has a primary home in another county and they're only leasing to try to get into Carroll County Public Schools. It's not everybody's top priority, but it happens.
And sometimes the mail is returned.
Right, and so yes, the role of the PPW in some cases is to try to build a case, because it's fraud, essentially, and so we may have to, once we get that documentation, approach a family and be very straight with them about why we believe they're not in the county, and if possible, come up with a compromise. As you said, we don't want to punish the child. Is there a clean break of the school year that we can say, okay, by this date, you do need to transfer to the appropriate county? And obviously, our goal is to look at what's best for a child.
Yeah, and I think when you are doing those investigations, always start with the enrollment form. This is where you said you lived. Print things, have the screen of what's the current emergency card say, who is involved, who's the guardians, who are the emergency contacts, so you know who, when you're having conversations, you get all these names and you're like, who is that person? And so it can become confusing, but it's important when you are sitting down with them that you document it when you attempted things, when you sent letters, when you did home visits, who you talked to, when you talked to the neighbor. So you have an array of evidence points that says it's really clear to us that you don't live here, and then this is our decision. Certainly you have a right to appeal it through due process, but and I think that's and most of the time when I've had that, they may become very upset in the beginning.
Yes.
But a lot of times too, they're like, okay, you got me, and I'm
right.
move
They
on.
don't want to be charged with a crime per se, and so they may say, what can we do? What can we do? We've been doing this to try to help our child, and that's always our goal too. So we want to try to approach it in a way that what can we do to resolve this that is fair and appropriate for the child.
And when I've had those situations too, when you approach it from, look, you've been coming back and forth for a long time. That's a lot of gas. It's a lot of stress on you as a parent. And I've had parents say that to me. It's killing me to get them here on time. So if you can approach it from that versus being the hammer, you know, you've been lying to us. I know you've been lying, and you're out. That doesn't help in the long run. That can just escalate a meeting to be something you just don't want it to be. So being professional and still trying to understand, even if they have been lying to you, being mindful of, even though it may not be the right reason, they do have their reasons about why they are trying to do that.
And in some cases too, there may be a legitimate hardship that you uncover. You go through all this questioning and you realize they lost their housing.
Right.
They're doubled up somewhere. Maybe they're just over the border, and we can come up with a compromise of busing them in for a certain amount of time. There are some creative things we can do if we have an honest conversation with the family about what is it that's really at the root of this.
I think the thing that the PPW too will have to fight is administrators or staff from the school saying, I know that kid doesn't live in our district, you need to kick him out or kick her out, and as the punisher. And sometimes certainly you have to be the formal person that tells them this is the policy and the procedure and this is going to be the decision. But remember, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are the things that you have to consider with non-residents, and there's certainly exceptions, but those are just things you have to keep in mind as you work with those families. And then we move on to kinship care.
It's like it's siblings. So kinship care is a Maryland.
And maybe you talk a little bit about how the two are different.
Yes,
Yeah.
I will try to do that. Okay. So kinship care, families can qualify under similar conditions. There's some kind of hardship going on. So here's where they're similar. Again, it could be, so a child is placed with a relative, and that's the key.
Yep.
Non-resident, they might not be with a relative. It could be some kind of other hardship situation. In many cases, it's a relative, or they're with their parents even. But with a kinship care, they are not with their parent. They are placed with a relative, and I think it can be as close as like a cousin relationship will qualify under kinship care. So they are placed with a relative because of a specific hardship. And those hardships, that's where the commonality, it may be the drug treatment or abandonment or death, incarceration, military. So there is some kind of hardship. This is a tuition-free placement. The child, because of a documented hardship, is with a relative. And in this case, the difference also being that the child already was living in Maryland and is still living in Maryland. So the caretaker is, because we're doing the kinship care application, the caretaker is in Carroll County. That we know. Whoever is assuming care is in Carroll County, and the parents previously lived in Maryland somewhere. So if the parents were out of state, that's where we have to look at a non-resident. That's the difference. Kinship care is all Maryland-based. The kids originated in Maryland, were placed with a relative in Carroll County, and there's a designated hardship. So we're never charging tuition for kinship care. That is a regulation that is there to protect children whose parents are in a hardship situation.
And so just to be clear, if the parent is living out of state, then you're looking at a non-resident.
Right.
If they live anywhere in Maryland, then we're looking at the kinship care, if they are with a relative. If they're anywhere in Maryland and they're living with a friend or some other person, but they're not living in your district, then you're looking at a non-resident situation.
Right.
Okay? So the key about kinship care is the relative piece.
Relative and originated in Maryland.
Okay?
Yes.
And so discuss the role of the PPW. No, sorry, I'm on the wrong section. What documentation is required when the relative is applying for the kinship?
Okay, yeah, so it's a very simple application where they're basically indicating, they're swearing, I am caring for this child 24/7, I am a relative, this is my relationship, and they're marking off what the hardship is. And we need some kind of accompanying documentation. If a parent perhaps is away in rehab, it could be something from that clinic indicating that the parent is there. If it's that a parent passed away, any kind of death notice or obituary to show that. If parent is in detention, it could be, even PPWs could look up and assist sometimes in documenting through a court document or a detention site that a parent is incarcerated.
And remember, I put on the narrated PowerPoint, divinelink.com is one of those, or the Maryland Case Search.
Yes.
Those are ways that you gain information about where the parents.
Yeah, case search is sometimes our best friend.
Yes.
I use that frequently. If they're active military, then a military order indicating that they were sent elsewhere. So some type of documentation. Sometimes there's not a formal document that can be provided, and we might have to have a relative write a statement about perhaps it's abandonment. Maybe it's the efforts they've made to try to locate a parent or have been unsuccessful. Could be a grandparent. Kids were dropped off there, parents never came back. And they're asking to please have the children go to school here because that's where the kids live. They live
Right.
with grandparents all this time. That's where they got to send them to school.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but maybe they weren't able to get a formal court placement because they couldn't locate the parents. Sometimes that's the issue is they can't locate the parents, they can't file for custody, and that can get tricky.
And so, kind of the last question, I think kinship care is pretty straightforward for the most part. And so the role of the PBW in that, especially as the year ends and then the summer starts.
Right, so similar to non-resident, we usually have this as an annual application. Of course, it could occur in the middle of the school year, but we generally approve it through the end of a school year. Each summer, we review any student designated as non-resident or kinship care. We send a letter to the caretakers basically saying, okay, we're heading into another school year. We need to have a new application filled out with continued supporting documentation. So can you provide continued documentation of this hardship? If the situation has come to an end, maybe parents have returned to the home or, essentially it's they've returned to the home or they've assumed care of their child, then we close that case and we look at, is the child able to stay in Carroll County because a parent is back in the situation, or do they need to transfer now to where the parent is living?
Yeah. And I think that's important, once the parent re-enters the home, then the kinship care on our behalf would close, and so all the decision-making power would return to the parent, unless the relative was deciding to grant guardianship, get guardianship, but they would need to do that. We wouldn't just maintain them as guardians under kinship care if the parent is in the home.
Right.
So, to be clear about when that ends. Now, I would also, of all these things that we talked about, this is a big part of your summer. Besides the fact that you would be having attendance meetings on kids who had chronic absences over the course of the prior year, dealing with homelessness, following up on foster care, and getting new applications for non-residents and kinship care cases, that's a big chunk of what you do in the summer. And so you end that year. So it's, as you do get to take a breath at the end of the school year, or it's a different pace, but you still have to maintain that organization and discipline to stay on task, because the school year can jump on top of you pretty quickly, and you realize, oh, I still have 7 homeless and 4 foster cares to figure out. And
yes, I was going to say, going back even depending on which clip we're watching, the homelessness, the foster care, non-resident, and kinship, we're trying to wrap up cases and decide whether we need to continue them into the next school year.
Right. So, of all of these things, again, it just gives you an idea of all the different things that PPW's become involved in. Thank you again for giving us some.
It's been fun. Thank you.
It's been fun. So you'll use all this as a way to help you get through this module. Okay.